The Founding Fathers, American Revolution, our Constitution, our history, America. Thanks so much for tuning in as we discuss the people, places, events, and battles that turned 13 separate colonies into the greatest nation on earth, the United States.
Welcome back, Patriots. I'm your host, Ron Kern, and thank you so much for allowing me to share my passion for the American Revolution and our country's history with you. Finally, the long-awaited Part 2 of Marquis de Lafayette is finally here. If you have not listened to Part 1, I encourage you to do so. First, because it's going to make a lot more sense. And in it, I share his amazing beginnings, his life, and what prompted him to leave his country of France, which actually resulted in a warrant for his arrest, and then come risk it all to fight for us in the American Revolution. In this show, I'm going to go ahead and talk about what his role was in the French Revolution, which even included 5 years in prison, and his several sit-down discussions with Napoleon Bonaparte himself. I think it's important to know these things, but the bulk of the show will be diving into his very famous return to America when he toured all 24 states by that time in 1824. His visit was far more important than I think many people realize, which is why I'm going to focus on it. Before I begin, though, I want to thank all of you who have been sending me emails, suggesting different show topics, and predominantly just a lot of words of encouragement and how much you like the show. And your comments and just the act of reaching out really makes my day, and I sincerely appreciate them. So it got me thinking of how can I make it even easier for you to contact me, because sometimes email is a bit cumbersome. So now you can leave me a voice message or even send me a text at the Patriot Power Podcast direct line, which is pretty easy to remember, 433-FREEDOM. That is, of course, listed at the bottom of my website, patriotpowerpodcast.com, and I would absolutely love to hear from you. So shoot me a text or leave me a voice message if you want, or if you have a show idea that you want me to focus in on. Lastly, the website is going to go through some minor changes where it's going to organize the podcast, the Patriot Power Freedom Files, and a new segment called Patriot Power Hidden Heroes. And in this new series, which is going to be pretty short, but hopefully very informative like the Freedom Files, it's going to focus and spotlight on people involved in the revolution, which likely 90% or more of them, you may not have ever heard their name. And to be honest, several were actually new to me, and it's quite fun researching and shining a light on everybody who was involved in the creation and shaping of our country, especially those people who aren't talked about as much in history books or more than likely even spoken about at all. This requires some pretty intense research and sifting through archives and diaries and many letters that have, thankfully, been saved for almost 250 years. So I hope you like this new series, which is going to be coming out in the next few weeks. All right, so let's dive into what Marquis de Lafayette did after our revolution ended, which is going to require a brief background, so let's go ahead and get started with that. Lafayette returned to France in 1781, where he was hailed as a national hero for his contributions to the American cause. And his experiences in America really deeply influenced his political views, which led him to advocate for liberty and democratic reforms. 8 years later, in 1789, he was elected as a representative of the nobility, where he played a crucial role in transforming it into a revolutionary National Assembly. He collaborated with Thomas Jefferson to draft the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which was adopted on August 27th in 1789, marking a pretty significant step toward establishing civil rights in France. Lafayette became the commander of the National Guard in July of that same year. And, well, he was tasked with maintaining order during the tumultuous early days of the Revolution, the French Revolution. He served as kind of moderator and attempted to mediate between the monarchy and the revolutionaries, but he kept finding himself caught in the middle, and he was really struggling because he was stuck right there in the middle with these conflicting factions, and it put him kind of in a rock and a hard place. And he was able to see both sides' positions, but he found it difficult to veer away from his actual beliefs and his morals. His efforts to protect King Louis VIII and Queen Marie Antoinette during the October 1789 mob invasion of Versailles showcased his commitment to constitutional monarchy, but this stance also alienated him from the more radical revolutionaries. And as the radical elements started to gain more and more power, Lafayette's popularity kind of took a dip, and it started to nosedive. And the turning point came during a July 1791 protest where his troops opened fire on demonstrators demanding the king's removal, which unfortunately resulted in numerous casualties. And this incident alone really damaged his reputation. In fact, he kind of was forced to resign from this command later that year. Now, following France's declaration of war against Austria in 1792, Lafayette attempted to suppress the radical uprisings, but eventually he got the heck out of Dodge, right? He fled France because the tensions had escalated to a crazy level. He was actually captured by Austrian forces and imprisoned for 5 years until his release, which happened in 1797. It's easy to say that he spent 5 years in prison and then talk about the events after he was released, but I think it's important to know what happened to him while he was in prison, which is why I dove a little deeper on this topic, because during his imprisonment from 1792 to 1797, he endured significant hardships, but he still remained committed to his principles. And Lafayette was actually not just kept in one prison, but he was moved around, being forced to stay in prison, 4 different prisons. And I'm going to list the first one he was at, and then the last one that he was confined in. The Prussian fortress at Wessel. There he faced pretty harsh conditions. He was confined in a very small cell. It had very little light, and it was so small, and they didn't let him out. He couldn't exercise. He was really subjected to a lot of hardships, and they never let him be alone. He was always under the surveillance of the guards constantly. He moved around to a couple other prisons, or they moved him around. And then the fortress of Olmütz in Austria was the last prison he was in. And after they transferred him there, he was just treated as a common prisoner, and his possessions were confiscated. He was given a number instead of a name. And the isolation that he encountered was profound. He didn't have any communication with the outside world. And at that point, his family and friends had no idea where he was even at for most of his imprisonment. So it was not a good deal for sure. And you have to keep in mind, he was not only exceptionally wealthy, he was the richest person in France, which, listening to episode 1 of this, I think it's episode 21, right? Part 1. He was really, really rich. So he went from that to a hero at the American Revolution, and now he sits in prison for 5 years. And despite all of that, he remained resolute, which takes a lot of character, I believe. He actually refused offers for his release, which would have required him to renounce his Republican ideals. And he said, nope, I'm not going to do that. I'll just sit here in prison, which is what he did. And his strong sense of identity and commitment to liberty helped him endure the psychological toll of his imprisonment. And early in his captivity, Lafayette was able to write his wife and get it to her. And he said, "Whatever may be the vicissitudes of fortune, my dear heart, my soul is not of the kind to give way." He also managed to write a letter using a toothpick that was dipped in lemon juice for the ink, and it expressed his thoughts on the entire political situation in France, and he conveyed messages of hope for liberty. So you have this guy sitting in prison, sneaking out letters. I don't know how he did it, but writing it in lemon juice and still being optimistic and sticking to his guns, refusing an early release because he did not want to renounce his beliefs and ideals. And what's crazy too is his imprisonment was really unknown outside of Austria. George Washington and other American leaders were unaware that he was imprisoned during much of the 5 years. And Washington had previously sought his release once he found that out, but he faced challenges due to the political climate in Europe. So, you have George Washington in the United States now, and he's asking for a prisoner to be released. That wasn't real high on the importance scale because, there was like a French Revolution going on. Despite attempts from friends like Gouverneur Morris to advocate for Lafayette, his situation actually remained pretty precarious. And Morris argued against executing Madame Lafayette during the Reign of Terror, emphasizing that the potential backlash from that and from America, if he or her were harmed, would not be good for them. So they did not execute her or him. So Lafayette's 5 years in prison was difficult, right? It was isolation and hardship, but it also, how I read and looked at things, is he really continued to have an unwavering commitment to liberty and democracy, and his ability to communicate that through letters, although very few, revealed his resilience. It showed his determination, and he remained true to his principles despite the overwhelming adversity. I mean, he's sitting in prison in Austria, and yet he's still optimistic and positive. It's pretty impressive. It wasn't until 1797 that Napoleon Bonaparte negotiated Lafayette's release, which allowed him to return to France and continue advocating for freedom. So whether you like or dislike Napoleon Bonaparte, at least he did that. And that's a big deal because Lafayette was a big deal. So when Lafayette returned to France, it was still grappling with the aftermath of the French Revolution, and he found himself kind of in a foreign country. Obviously, it was where he was born and raised, but it was to him kind of like a foreign country because it was dominated by these radical factions, and he was pretty cautious. He had to be pretty cautious about re-entering the public life, and even though he remained committed to the principles of liberty and constitutional governance, he still advocated for civil rights, and he sought to restore the ideals of the revolution, promoting kind of a constitutional monarchy as a preferable form of government. He supported many humanitarian causes. He fought for the rights of the Protestants in France and opposed the excesses of the revolutionary government, which, if you've studied the French Revolution at all, and I have just a little bit, everything the government did was in excess. It was absolutely crazy, and no wonder everybody rebelled against the king.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Hey, it's Bill Simmons from the Bill Simmons Podcast here to tell you about Michelob Ultra Courtside. It's getting fans closer to the NBA with a chance to win prizes like courtside seats, a trip to All-Star Weekend, and much more. Check it out at MichelobUltra.com/courtside. Michelob Ultra Superior Access, Courtside 24-25 sweepstakes, no purchase necessary. Open to U.S. residents 21 and up. Begins on October 1st, 2024, ends July 1st, 2025. Multiple entry periods. Visit MichelobUltra.com/courtside for free entry deadlines, and official rules. Message and data rates may apply. Void where prohibited.
But by 1799, with Napoleon Bonaparte consolidating power and establishing himself as the first consul, Lafayette's political aspirations were kind of curtailed. He chose at that time to live a much quieter life in exile in Germany and Holland, and he distanced himself from the increasingly authoritarian regime. So I'm going to shift. So that's what happened after the American Revolution, which he was so pinnacle in. And again, episode 21, part 1, goes into great detail. But I'm going to shift gears and move to the year 1824, which was, I believe, much more important than many people realize. So in 1824, Lafayette received an official invitation from then President James Monroe, and Monroe asked him to come tour the United States. This visit was significant not only for Lafayette, but also for the young nation, which really wanted to honor him as a hero of the American Revolution. And the tour allowed him to reconnect with the many people and friends that he met and many supporters that he didn't meet until this tour. And he wanted to restore his political standing back home. So it was kind of a win-win for him to come here. So after almost 40 years, he touched American soil again. Lafayette arrived in New York Harbor on August 15th in 1824 aboard a ship called Cadmus, but it was a Sunday, so he actually postponed his, quote, official entry into the city until the following day, which would have been August 16th. He was then escorted into Manhattan on the steamship the Chancellor Livingston, greeted by a very enthusiastic crowd of over 80,000 people. Keep in mind that the population back then of New York was obviously way less, smaller than it is now, but 80,000 people at the time comprised of 65% of New York City's entire population, which is astounding. For comparison, in today's numbers, it would mean that the crowd would have been 5.2 million people coming to see him. So it's a pretty staggering number, and it shows you just how many people knew about him and adored him, and how big of a deal Lafayette and his return was to the Americans. The harbor was filled with boats, all eager to catch a glimpse of the celebrated general. A newspaper account from the New York Mirror actually captured the excitement when it wrote, "Gentlemen are ready to throw by their business to shake him by the hand, and ladies forget their lovers to dream of him." And Thomas Jefferson expressed his joy in welcoming Lafayette back to America, stating that our little village of Charlottesville insists also on receiving you, highlighting the Lafayette's enduring connections with the American leaders. And what's really cool is he visited all 24 states, right? When he left, it was 13. He comes back, it's almost double. And he visited every single state. And although many amazing and wonderful events took place in each of those states, I'm just going to highlight some that I think might be of more interest to you. I'm not going to list every single state and their activities. But in Massachusetts, he laid the cornerstone for the Bunker Hill Monument, which was getting ready to approach the 50th anniversary of the Bunker Hill battle. And it's a really cool monument to visit. And if you dare to climb it, I just recommend that you be in shape, as it has 294 steps, and the stairway is very narrow, and it's completely spiral. My wife and I were quite gassed by the time we made it to the top. However, The view is pretty spectacular. He also visited Lexington and Concord, which I'm sure all of you know by now were the first battles of the American Revolution. In New Jersey, he was welcomed heartily in Trenton and Princeton. And you have to remember, these are the battles that really turned the tide of the war, because it inspired many of the men in the Continental Army to not leave once their enlistment was up. And a bulk of the men's enlistment was up on December 31st. So that is why the crossing of the Delaware on Christmas was so important. So that was a very, very big deal. He also attended a grand parade in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, where he actually spoke at Independence Hall. And he used that opportunity to reinforce the connection between France and America's fight for liberty. Lafayette also visited Virginia, and he did a lot of things in Virginia, but one of which was he visited Thomas Jefferson's estate, Monticello, and he was there actually for 11 days. And Thomas Jefferson expressed his joy in welcoming Lafayette with a heartfelt letter. He said, "Our little village of Charlottesville insists also on receiving you," which is the quote that I mentioned earlier. But I think one of the most poignant parts of his trip was when he visited Mount Vernon, and he wanted to give honor to his dear friend, George Washington, who had died 25 years prior to his visit. And George Washington passed away in the year 1799. And Lafayette's visit to Mount Vernon took place October 17th, I think. October 17th or 18th, I can't recall. But that visit was really emotional for him. And he arrived at Mount Vernon with a very heavy heart, but he was also very eager to pay his respects to his late friend and mentor, George Washington. And Lafayette, if you've ever been to Mount Vernon, it's an amazing place. It's incredible. You have to walk past the home and down the field and around the bottom where the tomb where George Washington is. So it's a little bit of a walk, but it's downhill. And Lafayette told everybody around him, "I'm going to his tomb alone." His secretary, Auguste Levasseur, described the scene. Lafayette descended alone into the vault, and when he reappeared, his eyes were overflowing with tears. And Lafayette later wrote in a letter to his family, he said, "This moment oppresses my heart." The visit to the tomb was a solemn and very personal moment for Lafayette. It allowed him to reflect on his very deep bond and connection with Washington and the sacrifices made during the American Revolution. After he visited the tomb, he then explored the mansion and walked around the grounds. And he was particularly moved to see the key to the Bastille prison, which Lafayette had actually sent to George Washington as a token of their friendship. And this visit to Mount Vernon was a significant moment in Lafayette's tour of the United States because it allowed him to honor the memory of his friend and pay tribute to the ideals of the American Revolution. And Mount Vernon is hands down my favorite historical home to visit. And even though I live here in Idaho, we've been to Mount Vernon several times. And when you walk in the front door, the Bastille key that Lafayette sent to Washington is hanging on the wall on the left-hand side. It's a pretty spectacular thing to see in person. The entire state is amazing to see in person. So if you have not been to Mount Vernon, I highly recommend it. And Lafayette didn't really wish to elaborate on his personal experience when visiting Washington's tomb alone, but he did say, "I have come to gaze once more upon the tomb of my hero, my father, my friend. My heart is filled with gratitude and sorrow." Kind of sums it up. Washington's remains are enclosed in a very heavy stone coffin. It's carved from marble, and it bears his name. And to the left of him, as you look into the tomb, is a matching one for his wife, Martha Washington. And if you've been to my website, which I hope you have, you may have seen the photo of me having the honor and blessing of laying the wreath by Washington's sarcophagus in his tomb at Mount Vernon. They typically will ask the people in the area at the time if anybody's a veteran, and they typically will choose a veteran. And so I'm so thankful that I was actually chosen. It was one of my most cherished moments being in Mount Vernon or at Mount Vernon. In fact, it's just something I'll never forget. And being that close to the man I so much admire for countless reasons was pretty special. Now, the tomb is locked and secured at all other times except during the wreath-laying ceremony that they do once a day. I think they do it once a day. To think, though, that Lafayette and Washington were so close. They were involved so much in the founding of our country. They fighting together, leading together, sharing thoughts and feelings and conversations that likely weren't written down and were just between themselves. I cannot imagine what was going through Lafayette's mind while paying his respects to Washington. They shared a tremendously special and close bond, one of unequaled respect, admiration, and love. And I think their relationship is one that, compared to relationships today, is probably a rarity. In a previous podcast, I may have mentioned that nobody walked up to Washington, patted him on the back, or hugged him, and certainly never kissed him on the cheek. That is, except Lafayette. And the story of George Washington's unapproachable demeanor, where people claimed it would be impossible to casually pat him on the back or even hug him, actually has some validity in the awe that Washington inspired. He was widely known for his stoic and reserved nature, and he exuded a presence that commanded respect. Some individuals even joked that it would be a feat to go up to Washington, give him a friendly pat on the back, and his formal kind of regal bearing made people hesitant to treat Washington with anything other than utmost reverence. And a friend of George Washington, Gouverneur Morris, made a bet that he could easily walk up to Washington, slap him on the back, and, say, good job, old man, or whatever, a level of familiarity reserved for close friends or equals. However, as the story goes, when Morris approached Washington, he immediately lost his nerve after he looked at Washington, who was composed and there in his imposing presence, thus proving the point that even his friends found it difficult to break the formality that surrounded George Washington. I share this because in almost every account that I researched, this was true, except for Lafayette. George Washington and Lafayette had a famously warm relationship, and one that included hugs and even the French custom of kissing on the cheek. And despite Washington's reserved and formal demeanor, he had a deep bond with Lafayette, treating him almost like an adopted son. I think their connection kind of transcended Washington's usual aura of stoic formality and, being the general and being, untouchable. Because if Washington allowed this, it tells us that the magnitude of respect and fondness that he had for Lafayette was pretty much not equal to any other person. During their emotional farewell address at France's Tavern in New York in 1784, Lafayette reportedly embraced Washington and kissed him on both cheeks, as was customary, right, in the French culture. This embrace reflected just how close and affectionate they were and how much they cared for each other, especially after fighting side by side during the Revolution. And I could not find any other recorded time that anybody else there did that. Most would walk up to Washington, give him a very respectful handshake, a few words were exchanged, but nobody hugged and kissed Washington except Lafayette. And Lafayette really continued to be inspiring when he wrote about his experience during this tour. And he said he was referring to like the overwhelming response that he got from the American people. Lafayette said, quote, "Everywhere, on all roads, in all villages, I have met your happy, free, grateful citizens. I am constantly surrounded by the people of the United States. They press my hands, they embrace me, they cheer and cry, 'Welcome, welcome, Lafayette.'" And he also observed the sense of national pride during his tour of the 24 states. And he wrote, "The attachment of the American people to the principles of freedom and self-government is deeply engraven on their hearts. It is evidenced in every look and in every gesture." He also said, quote, "It is impossible to describe the joy I feel to see these great people still animated by the pure principles of liberty to which they owe their rank in the world." And kind of as a summation for his entire tour, he reminisced with, quote, "America's kindness has affected me deeply. These 16 months have passed like a dream, a touching reminder that liberty, once fought for, never dies." Lafayette's legacy continued to resonate in both France and America, remembered not only as just a military hero, but as a true champion of liberty whose ideals transcended borders. So why was Lafayette's return to America in 1824 and into 1825 so important? Well, I think it holds profound significance because the United States was a very young nation and it offered a rare and powerful link to its revolutionary past. And just as the United States was approaching its 50th anniversary, Lafayette, who, by the way, was one of the last living heroes of the Revolutionary War and the last surviving general of the American Revolution, he symbolized the ideals of liberty and democracy and the enduring alliance between the United States and France. His presence reignited patriotic pride, and that helped really connect the citizens back to the founding ideals during the time when the nation's identity was really still evolving. Lafayette's tour also helped heal divisions by bringing Americans together across regions and social classes. His visit inspired Americans to preserve and celebrate their Revolutionary War heritage, prompting a wave of public monuments, historic preservation, and civic pride. And furthermore, it really solidified Lafayette's legacy as an enduring American ally. This visit also had some diplomatic resonance because Lafayette served as the unofficial ambassador of Republican values at a time when democracy was still quite fragile and was being challenged globally. And his statements about liberty and governance reinforced the nation's self-image as a beacon of freedom. It motivated future generations, requiring them to uphold these principles. And for Americans, his presence was a vivid reminder of all the sacrifices that were made that helped shape our country. And it made his journey a sentimental moment in solidifying the narrative of American unity, freedom, and historical continuity. Because at the time, nobody was, I shouldn't say nobody, a lot of people were just kind of doing their own thing. And yes, we won the revolution. But after that, it wasn't all, roses. It was quite difficult. And a lot of strife was taking place. So getting everybody back into being patriotic, remembering the sacrifices that took place, it really helped galvanize all of the people in the now 24 states. And it was just a really, really positive thing. And that's why one reason why it's such a big deal.
Love, exciting and new. Hello, Hannah Waddingham here. Have you seen the fabulous new Sun Princess? World-class entertainment, exceptional dining, and the greatest pizza ever. It's a love
Don't miss our Come Aboard sale with up to 40% off and free room upgrades. Visit princess.com or call your travel advisor to book. Princess Cruises. Terms and restrictions apply. Offer ends 2/28/25. Ships of Bermudan and British Registry.
In Lafayette's final years, he lived quietly at his estate, which was La Grange near Paris, which, by the way, is looks like a castle out of a movie. It was huge. But following his wife passing in 1807, Lafayette devoted much of his time to his family and welcomed many guests, most of which were Americans who really wanted to see and meet him, that admired his contributions to the United States because they were plentiful. And Lafayette remained still remained a very big advocate for liberty, and he continued to voice his political beliefs and opposed any form of tyranny and championing Republican ideals. In 1834, Lafayette gave his last public speech in the Chamber of Deputies, and shortly after, his health started to decline. He was at a funeral. He collapsed because of pneumonia. He recovered briefly, but then fell ill again during a stormy day in May, and he became bedridden. And on May 20th, in 1834, he passed away in Paris, with the cause being pneumonia. Lafayette was 76 years old. Lafayette's burial was marked by symbolism and very deep reverence. He was interred beside his beloved wife in the Picpus Cemetery in Paris, and in a gesture of enduring respect and solidarity, Lafayette's son, who was named Georges Washington Lafayette, sprinkled soil from Bunker Hill onto his father's grave, which is a pretty poignant reminder of how powerful the bond between Lafayette and the American cause was for him. The funeral itself was solemn, as you can imagine. King Louis Philippe ordered a military funeral, though it was limited to a private affair because he didn't want massive crowds from gathering, as I'm sure they would have. But despite that, many still came to honor Lafayette from afar, and in the United States, President at the time, Andrew Jackson, ordered national mourning similar to the honors that were given to George Washington. Congress even had both houses draped in black and encouraged Americans to observe mourning for the hero of two worlds, who had become such an enduring symbol of Franco-American friendship and the shared ideals of liberty. His grave in France is covered with the American flag to this day, which is a very rare honor for a foreign-born individual. And I actually have a photo of this in the show notes, along with some really good videos, a couple other photos, and some books that, if you want to dive deeper, you should get, or I recommend at least. So with this episode, we have finally concluded our two-part series on Marquis de Lafayette, and I hope it brings his story to life and offers you a richer, a better understanding of his remarkable legacy. And, you know, we covered Lafayette's birth, growing up, traveling to America illegally, and fighting in the American Revolution. All of this was covered in episode 21. And this show, we covered his role in the French Revolution, discussing the details and importance of his trip back to the United States in 1824 and what his actions were up until his death. We have now come to the part of the show called Lesser Known, Fun, or Interesting Facts, of course relating to Marquis de Lafayette. While Lafayette is well known for his contributions to the American Revolution, many people don't realize that he was only 19 years old when he got here in America. He played a significant role in securing French support for the American colonies, helping to persuade King Louis XVI to send troops and resources. Quite a big deal. Lafayette and George Washington formed a deep friendship, which I have heavily discussed, but Lafayette referred to Washington as a father figure, and their relationship had a lasting impact on both of them. Washington wrote many letters to Lafayette addressing him as "my dear boy." Lafayette was an early advocate for the abolition of slavery. He was a member of the Society of the Friends of the Blacks, which aimed to promote the rights of enslaved people. And he also believed in the ideals of liberty and equality, not just for the French, but for all people. In the United States, Lafayette is often celebrated as a hero. Many places and institutions bear his name, including Lafayette College, which is in Pennsylvania, the Lafayette Escadrille, which was a squadron of American volunteer pilots in World War I, and numerous statues and monuments dedicated to him across the country. There's cities named after him. So his contributions to both the American and French Revolution have made him a symbol of liberty and democracy. And lastly, Lafayette's legacy was so impactful that he was often invoked during the American Civil War. The Union forces honored him by adopting the name Lafayette for some of their regiments, and his ideals of liberty were used to inspire troops fighting against slavery. Please consider doing a review of my podcast. It takes just a few seconds, and the more reviews makes it easier for people to find it. If you want to help financially, you can become a monthly supporter or make a one-time donation. You can easily do this by visiting patriotpowerpodcast.com and click on Support Podcast. And lastly, please check out my show notes for this and all episodes, where I provide videos, links, book recommendations, and all of that is neatly organized for you. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay free, and honor the legacy of those who came before us, and help me keep the spirit of 1776 burning bright.
Thanks for listening, and hope that you tune in next time with us here at the Patriot Power Podcast. Make sure that you hit subscribe so you'll get notified when our new episodes are available for you. And we hope that you check out our websites, which include our show notes, links, documents, and more at patriotpowerpodcast.com or ilovegeorgewashington.com. Until next time, hope that you and your family have a blessed week. And remember, be safe and tell a veteran thanks for their service.